The Brantley farm sat 2 miles north of Council Grove, Kansas, where the Santa Fe Trail bent toward the Solomon River. Travelers heading west in 1879 noticed it from the wagon ruts. White clapboard that never peeled, split rail fences that stood plumb, corn rows so straight they looked surveyed. In a territory where night riders burned black homesteads for sport, where every freedman family kept loaded rifles by the door and slept in shifts, the Brantleys seemed untouched. Their well pump never ran dry. Their chickens laid through winter. White merchants in town would not meet their eyes, but always extended credit. The whispers started in 1877 and grew stranger each season. Folks said the family moved like shadows, that their farm smelled wrong after dark. Not livestock rot, something mineral and deep. The county sheriff visited once in 1878, asking about missing men. Isaiah Brantley, the father, offered him coffee on the porch and answered every question with a question until the lawman left in silence. 2 weeks later, the sheriff sold his badge and moved to Topeka. No one replaced him for 11 months. The soil in Morris County, Kansas, held grudges. Settlers who broke sod there in the 1870s learned fast that the land gave nothing without taking something back. Drought cracked the earth one summer. Flash floods drowned crops the next. Grasshoppers arrived in clouds thick enough to darken the sun, stripping fields to stubble in hours. Most homesteaders lasted 2 seasons before abandoning their claims to wealthier men who could afford to lose a year's harvest. The Exodus families, freed slaves fleeing the South after Reconstruction collapsed, faced every natural hardship plus the human ones. White neighbors cut their irrigation ditches. General stores refused their trade. And at night, riders came. The Brantley place defied every pattern. They filed their claim in April of 1876, the same month George Armstrong Custer marched toward the Little Bighorn. Isaiah Brantley signed the paperwork with a careful X at the land office in Council Grove. The clerk, a thin man named Amos Kettering, noted in the margin that the claimant was a Negro of approximately 50 years, accompanied by a woman and 3 grown children. The claim covered 160 acres of tall grass prairie on the north side of Skunk Creek, where the ground rolled in long swells like frozen waves. Previous owners had lasted 6 months before a barn fire sent them back to Illinois. By autumn of that same year, the Brantleys had raised a house, a barn, and fences that would outlast both. Travelers on the Santa Fe Trail saw the farm from a distance first. The white clapboard caught morning light like a signal mirror. Isaiah had built the house himself, 20 feet by 30, with a stone foundation and real glass windows. Not the waxed paper most homesteaders used, but paned glass ordered from Kansas City and hauled in on freight wagons. The barn stood even larger, framed from oak beams cut in the creek bottom and fitted with wooden pegs instead of nails. Everything about the place spoke of money they should not have had, skills that took years to learn, and a confidence that bordered on provocation. Ruth Brantley kept the only vegetable garden in 3 counties that thrived without constant tending. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines through September. Squash grew the size of wash buckets. She sold surplus at the Council Grove Market on Saturdays, arriving in a wagon driven by her eldest son, Caleb. White women bought her produce but would not speak to her. They placed coins on the tailgate without making eye contact, took their vegetables, and hurried away as if proximity might transfer some unnamed contagion. The Brantley children, Caleb, Esther, and Samuel, moved through town with a discipline that unnerved the locals. They never loitered. They conducted business in silence. When white men blocked their path for sport, they simply waited, patient as fence posts, until the men grew bored and stepped aside. Esther, the daughter, wore her hair wrapped in blue cloth and kept her gaze on the middle distance, giving nothing. Samuel, the youngest at 24, was built like his father, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could snap axe handles. He smiled at no one. Caleb, the eldest, was the one people watched. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against dark skin, shaped like a fisherman's hook. The story changed depending on who told it. Some said he got it in a knife fight in Leavenworth. Others claimed it was a whip scar from slavery days, though the angle was wrong for that. Caleb never explained. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and worked the farm with the efficiency of someone who had calculated every motion to eliminate waste. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice carried no inflection. Facts delivered like receipts. They grew their fear like a crop. By 1878, the Brantley farm had become a waypoint for black travelers moving west. Families on the Exeter Trail knew to look for the white clapboard house with the bell hung by the front door. If the bell rang freely in the wind, the house was safe. If it hung silent, wrapped in cloth, travelers should move on. Ruth fed people at a long table in the kitchen. Cornbread and beans, fried chicken when they had it, always coffee. Isaiah sat at the head of the table and asked questions that sounded like casual conversation, but added up to intelligence gathering. Where are you coming from? What did you see on the roads? Any riders following? How many? The Brantleys never charged for the meals, but travelers who stayed the night often left small offerings: a sack of flour, a handful of cartridges, information about who was buying rope in bulk or which sheriffs were looking the other way. In this manner, the family built a network that stretched from Nicodemus to Dodge City, a web of favors and warnings that moved faster than telegraph lines. But the question that haunted every traveler who stopped at the farm was always the same. How did they survive? Isaiah Brantley was born enslaved on the Whitmore estate in northern Mississippi in 1826. The year he turned 12, the overseer discovered he could track a man through standing water by reading the displacement patterns in mud 2 days old. It was not a skill anyone had taught him. He simply saw what others missed: the bent grass stem, the stone turned wrong side up, the deer trail that showed human boot prints underneath when you looked at the angle of broken twigs. Master Josiah Whitmore bred hunting dogs for neighboring plantations. He also rented Isaiah out to track runaways. By 1845, Isaiah had become the most effective tracker in 3 counties. Plantation owners paid $20 per captured fugitive, plus expenses. Isaiah worked with 2 dogs, a blue-tick hound named Saul and a bloodhound called Mercy, and could find a week-old trail in drought conditions. He knew how runaways thought, because he thought the same way himself every single day. Water runs downhill, moss grows north, the moon rises in the east. He learned to think like prey, and then use that knowledge to become the perfect predator. He found 63 people between 1845 and 1861. This was not a record he kept willingly. The numbers came from the ledger Josiah Whitmore maintained, a leather-bound book that listed every transaction involving Isaiah's labor. Whitmore treated Isaiah like a prize stallion, valuable enough to feed well, dangerous enough to watch carefully. Isaiah was never beaten. He was never sold. He was never allowed to marry because Whitmore believed sentiment made a man less effective. But Whitmore made a mistake in 1857 when he purchased Ruth from a failing plantation in Alabama. Ruth was a house slave who had learned to read by stealing her mistress's prayer book and sounding out words in the cellar. She was 22 when she arrived at Whitmore Estate, 31 when the war started. She and Isaiah were not permitted to marry, but they formed an attachment that Whitmore chose to ignore because Ruth kept the kitchen running and Isaiah kept bringing runaways back. Ruth bore 3 children between 1852 and 1855: Caleb, Esther, Samuel. Whitmore allowed Isaiah to claim them as his own. It was a gift, or what passed for one in a system where your children could be sold at auction before they learned to walk. Then 1861 arrived, and the nation tore itself in half. Master Josiah Whitmore enlisted as a captain in the Mississippi Cavalry and left his plantation in the care of his brother-in-law, a man named Nathaniel Cross, who believed that enslaved people required regular whipping to remain docile. Isaiah watched Cross beat a 14-year-old boy to death over a broken plow blade in August of 1862. He buried the boy in the woods beyond the cotton fields and marked the grave with a stone. Then he waited. The Union Army reached northern Mississippi in April of 1863. Isaiah led his family off Whitmore Estate on the night of April 9th, following a route he had memorized over 17 years of hunting other people. He knew every creek crossing, every place the dogs would lose scent, every house where sympathizers might hide them or turn them in. They moved like smoke, 56 miles in 3 days, staying off roads, drinking from streams, eating raw corn stolen from cribs. They reached Union lines at Corinth on April 12th, so exhausted that Ruth collapsed and slept for 18 hours straight. The Union Army offered Isaiah a different kind of work. They needed trackers to find Confederate scouts, to map enemy movements, to identify which routes supply wagons were using. Isaiah agreed on one condition. His family stayed together, in writing, notarized. A quartermaster named Benjamin Farrow signed the papers and kept his word. For 2 years, Isaiah worked behind Confederate lines, using the same skills he had used to hunt runaways. But now he hunted the men who had sent him hunting. He found 37 Confederates between 1863 and 1865. This number also came from a ledger, a Union Army record book that tracked scouts and their confirmed reports. Isaiah brought back intelligence that changed the outcome of 3 minor engagements and 1 major cavalry action near Tupelo. He was never commissioned, never paid more than $10 a month, and never mentioned in any official dispatches. When the war ended, he received a mustering out certificate and 40 acres of scrip for land in Kansas Territory. The war taught them what they already knew. White men would always come for them. By 1866, Isaiah and Ruth had moved to Kansas with their children and settled on bottomland near Fort Leavenworth. They tried farming but discovered that the skills that made Isaiah an effective tracker made him a mediocre farmer. The land did not respond to watching and patience. It required brutal, repetitive labor that left him feeling caged. He planted corn in 1867 and lost it to cutworms. He planted wheat in 1868 and watched hail shred it a week before harvest. Then, in 1869, a man came to their door at midnight. His name was Thomas Greer, and he was running from a gang of night riders who called themselves the White Brotherhood. Greer was a freedman who had testified against 2 white men for stealing his horse. The men were acquitted, and the Brotherhood came for Greer 3 days later. He ran. Isaiah listened to the story, looked at Ruth, and made a decision that would define the next decade of their lives. He hunted the men who were hunting Thomas Greer. It took him 4 days. He found them camped in a ravine 7 miles south. drinking whiskey and laughing about what they would do to Greer when they caught him. Isaiah waited until dark, then moved through their camp like something that had learned to walk upright but remained fundamentally other. He did not kill them. He did not need to. He took their horses, their weapons, and their boots. He left them alive, 5 miles from the nearest settlement, in country where rattlesnakes outnumbered people. When Isaiah returned home, Thomas Greer was gone, headed west with new boots and traveling money Ruth had pressed into his hand. But word of what Isaiah had done spread through the freedmen communities like fire in dry grass. Within 6 months, 3 more families came to his door at night, and Isaiah helped everyone. By 1876, when they filed the homestead claim in Morris County, Isaiah and Ruth had assisted 41 families in escaping night riders, vigilantes, and Klan remnants. They had never lost anyone. They had never been caught. And they had learned that the best defense was not to hide, but to make predators afraid to hunt. The farm in Morris County was not a homestead. It was a fortress disguised as one. The first thing Isaiah did after filing the land claim was walk the entire 160 acres in a grid pattern, noting every rise, every hollow, every place water pooled after rain. He spent 3 weeks on this survey, returning to the temporary dugout shelter each evening to sketch maps on brown paper Ruth had saved from supply packages. The maps showed elevations, sightlines, natural choke points, and areas where the tall grass grew thick enough to hide a man lying flat. Caleb, Esther, and Samuel helped him mark the routes. They used stakes driven into the ground at 50-foot intervals, each stake notched in a pattern only the family understood. To an outsider, the stakes looked like surveying marks for fencing or irrigation ditches. In reality, they marked the borders of killing zones, places where a man on horseback would be silhouetted against sky, or funneled between 2 rises that turned into a crossfire position. The house itself was built on the highest point of the property, with windows facing all 4 directions. Isaiah cut the window openings before raising the walls, sizing them to allow rifle barrels to rest on the sills without exposing the shooter. The walls were 2 layers of clapboard with 6 inches of packed dirt between them. Not enough to stop a bullet, but enough to absorb some of its force. The roof was cedar shakes, less likely to ignite from torch brands than thatch or tar paper. The barn was positioned 100 yards southeast of the house, far enough that a fire would not spread, close enough to reach during a fight. Inside, Isaiah built a false floor over a cellar dug 8 feet deep. The cellar held water barrels, preserved food, ammunition, and weapons wrapped in oilcloth. A tunnel led from the cellar to the creek bed, surfacing behind a rock overhang. If the house and barn were overrun, the family could retreat underground and emerge a 1/4 mile away. No one outside the family knew about the tunnel. Samuel did most of the digging, working at night so neighbors would not see the dirt piles. He moved the soil in buckets to different parts of the property, scattering it thin enough that grass grew over it within weeks. The tunnel ceiling was supported by oak beams, and the floor was gravel that drained water toward the creek. Isaiah tested it during the spring flood of 1877 by sending Esther through while water ran 2 feet deep outside. She emerged dry. They built in layers: house, barn, tunnel, earth. The fencing came next. Split rails on 1,200 linear feet of them, cut from trees in the creek bottom and hauled up the slope on a stone boat pulled by their mule. The fences followed the property line on the south and west sides, where the Santa Fe Trail brought the most traffic. But on the north and east sides, where the land rolled into rougher country, Isaiah left the fences incomplete. There were gaps, deliberately placed, where a rider could enter the property without realizing he was being funneled toward prepared positions. Esther strung the bells. She used copper wire salvaged from an abandoned telegraph line and hung small brass bells at intervals through the trees along the creek. The bells were positioned where branches would brush them in wind, creating a constant low chiming that became background noise. But when a person moved through the timber, even carefully, the bells rang different, higher-pitched, faster. Esther could tell from inside the house whether movement in the trees was wind, deer, or men. The bells were one of 3 warning systems. The second was older. Ruth kept geese. 7 of them, white Emdens that had come with a family from Ohio who stopped at the farm in 1877. The travelers had nothing to trade for a meal except the geese, and Ruth accepted them, knowing that geese were better than dogs for raising alarm. Dogs could be silenced with poisoned meat. Geese were too aggressive to approach quietly, and their calls carried a quarter mile. Ruth let them range freely around the house during the day and penned them near the front door at night. They slept lightly and hated strangers. The third system was the children. Caleb, Esther, and Samuel took turns staying awake through the night, 4-hour rotations that ensured someone was always listening. They sat in the dark house without lamps, letting their eyes adjust until they could see shapes moving across starlit grass. Isaiah had trained them the same way he had trained himself during slavery. You learned to hear the world before you saw it. The creak of leather saddle, the clink of bit chain, the breathing of horses pushed too hard. By 1878, the Brantley farm had become something unique in Kansas territory, a place where black travelers were fed, sheltered, and sent on their way with more than they arrived with. A place where white raiders came but did not leave. The number was never recorded in any ledger, but the family knew. 11 men between April 1877 and March 1879. All of them night riders. All of them armed. All of them dead or disappeared. The first group had been 4 men who rode in drunk on a July evening, firing rifles in the air and shouting about teaching a lesson. Isaiah let them approach within 100 yards before he, Caleb, and Samuel opened fire from 3 windows simultaneously. 2 men went down immediately. The third tried to retreat and rode directly into a ditch Isaiah had dug across the northwest trail approach. His horse broke its foreleg, throwing him. The 4th man fled. They found him 2 days later, dead from thirst and exposure, 3 miles from the nearest water. The second incident was quieter. 2 men who came on foot at night, carrying torches. Esther heard the bells. Ruth released the geese. The men tried to outrun them and ran directly into the barbed wire Caleb had strung at shin height between 2 fence posts. They fell forward, screaming. Samuel shot them where they lay. Isaiah and Caleb buried the bodies in unmarked graves along the creek bed, where spring floods would scatter the bones. The third incident involved 5 men on horseback. Isaiah recognized 2 of them from town, merchants who sold flour and tobacco. They came in October, just after harvest, when the barn was full. Isaiah did not shoot them. Instead, he let them enter the property, then used a system of ropes rigged through pulleys to collapse the trail behind them. Trees fell across the path, blocking retreat. The men panicked and rode toward the barn. Caleb was waiting in the loft. None of those men rode out. They became whispers, then rumors, then warnings passed from wagon train to wagon train. Stay clear of the Brantley place. Something's wrong there. But the disappearances had a cost that Isaiah had not anticipated. The people who vanished had families. They had friends who asked questions, and eventually, those questions reached the ears of men who believed that answering them with violence was both their right and their duty. By March of 1879, those men had formed a new organization. They called themselves the Council of Preservation, and they were coming. The Council of Preservation held its first meeting on February 14, 1879, in the back room of Kettering's General Store in Council Grove. 7 men attended. Each had been invited personally by Amos Kettering, the land office clerk, who had filed the Brantley homestead claim 3 years earlier. Kettering was 32 years old, balding, with hands permanently stained by ink from his ledger work. He was not a violent man by nature, but he believed deeply in order, and the Brantley situation represented disorder that threatened the foundations of civilization as he understood them. He opened the meeting with a ledger, not the one from the land office. This was personal. Kettering had been keeping records of men who had gone missing in Morris County since 1876. He read the names aloud. Cyrus Holt, disappeared July 1877. James and Tobias Glenn, disappeared same month. Martin Overstreet, disappeared October 1877. The list continued. 14 names total, spanning 30 months. Each man had last been seen riding north toward the Brantley property. None had returned. "We know where they went," Kettering said. "We know what happened." The men around the table nodded. They were merchants, landowners, a minister, a banker. Not Klansmen. The Klan had been driven underground in Kansas by federal prosecution in the early 1870s. But they were men who had been Klansmen, or who sympathized with men who had been, and they understood that power required organization, secrecy, and the willingness to enforce consequences. The banker, whose name was Elijah Moss, asked the question no one else would voice. "Are we certain these Negroes are responsible? 14 men is a lot to kill without someone noticing." Kettering tapped his ledger. "I've spoken to families. I've tracked the patterns. Every man who went missing was last seen heading toward that farm. Either the Brantleys are killing them, or they're very unlucky neighbors." "Have you spoken to the sheriff?" "We don't have a sheriff. Not since Willard quit last year." The room was silent. Everyone knew why Willard had quit. He had visited the Brantley farm to ask about Martin Overstreet and had left so shaken that he sold his badge within a week. The story he told later, drunk in a Topeka saloon, was that Isaiah Brantley had answered every question with a question and offered him coffee with a smile that never reached his eyes. "That man was measuring me," Willard said. "Same way you measure a coffin." Kettering continued. "The point is, we have no law enforcement, which means we must enforce law ourselves." "You mean lynch them," the minister said. His name was Hiram Stokes, and he was 46 years old. He had preached in Council Grove for 11 years, delivering sermons that carefully balanced Christian mercy with social order. He had never openly advocated violence, but he had also never condemned it when it occurred. He considered this a form of moral leadership, acknowledging reality without endorsing it. Kettering shook his head. "I mean, bring them to justice. Legal justice, if possible. But if the family resists, if they fire on us when we approach, then we respond appropriately." "That's still lynch law." "No," Kettering said patiently. "Lynch law is mob action without structure. We're not a mob, we're a council. We have rules, records, a chain of command. We're bringing order to chaos." The distinction satisfied everyone except Hiram Stokes, who said nothing but made a note to himself to be elsewhere when the council rode out. He was not opposed to the outcome. He agreed that the Brantleys posed a threat, but he preferred not to be present for the methods. This was a form of complicity he had perfected over 20 years of ministry, endorsing conclusions while remaining carefully absent from the actions that produced them. The council spent 2 hours planning. They would approach the farm with overwhelming force, 20 men armed with rifles and revolvers. They would ride in daylight, not as night riders, but as citizens. They would announce themselves, demand that the Brantleys answer questions about the missing men, and if the family resisted, they would burn the buildings and force them out. Moss, the banker, raised a practical concern. What if they've done nothing? What if we're wrong? Kettering opened his ledger again. Then they should be able to explain why 14 men disappeared after visiting their property. If they have explanations, we'll listen. But we'll listen with 20 armed men surrounding their house. What would you do knowing your neighbors were planning this? Would you warn the family? Would you join the council? Or would you, like Reverend Stokes, simply stay home? The meeting adjourned at 10:45 that night. Each man agreed to recruit 2 others, bringing the total to 21. They set a date, March 23, 1879. The attack would happen at dawn, when men and animals were sluggish, when the Brantleys would be gathered for breakfast. Kettering made a final entry in his ledger. Council of Preservation established February 14. Purpose: restore order to Morris County. First action, March 23. He closed the book and locked it in his store safe, where it would remain for over a century before a historical society discovered it during an estate sale. Rebecca Holloway owned the boarding house 2 blocks from Kettering's store. She was a widow, 53 years old, who rented rooms to travelers and kept a clean house with good food. She had been standing on her porch the night of February 14th when she saw 7 men slip into the alley beside Kettering's store. She recognized all of them, pillars of the community, men who attended church and paid their debts. She said nothing. This was not cowardice. Rebecca had survived a cholera epidemic, the death of 2 children, and the collapse of her husband's freight business. She understood that survival often required watching without speaking. She also understood what those men were planning, because she had heard similar conversations before the war in Missouri, where men gathered in back rooms to discuss which abolitionists needed to be driven out. The pattern was always the same: ledgers and rules and the language of order, followed by rope and fire. Rebecca had served breakfast to Isaiah Brantley on 3 occasions when he came to town for supplies. He ate in silence, paid in cash, and left no mess. His children were equally courteous. She had never heard them raise their voices or cause trouble, but she also knew that courtesy and innocence were different things, and she suspected Isaiah Brantley was neither innocent nor safe. Still, she said nothing. On February 16th, a black woman named Sarah Corbin stopped at the boarding house. She was traveling with her husband and 2 children, heading west toward Nicodemus. Rebecca fed them in the kitchen, not the dining room where white guests would object, and listened as Sarah talked about stopping at the Brantley farm the previous night. "Good people," Sarah said. "Fed us till we couldn't eat no more. Told us which roads to avoid." Rebecca wanted to warn her. She wanted to say, "Something is coming for that family, and if you care about them, you should tell them." But warning Sarah would mean admitting she had seen the council members meeting. It would mean taking a side, and taking sides got people hurt. So Rebecca said nothing. She gave Sarah an extra loaf of bread for the journey, and accepted no payment for the meal. She told herself this was kindness enough. Silence is its own language. Everyone in Council Grove spoke it fluently. The blacksmith, Thomas Gareth, shod horses for 3 council members in the week before March 23rd. He noticed they were preparing for hard riding, new shoes all around, extra nails, checking fit twice. He knew what it meant. He had been a blacksmith in Lawrence, Kansas, during the border wars, and had shod horses for Quantrill's raiders before they burned the town in 1863. He recognized the smell of coming violence the way other men recognized storm clouds. He did his work and said nothing. The postmaster, Leonard Fitch, saw letters arriving at the Brantley farm twice a month. They came from Nicodemus, Leavenworth, and as far south as Indian Territory. The handwriting varied, but the pattern was consistent. Someone was coordinating communication between black communities across Kansas. Fitch believed this was dangerous. He believed it represented organization, and organized Negroes were a threat to the natural order. He had considered reporting the letters to federal authorities. The Comstock Act of 1873 prohibited using mail to distribute materials that corrupted public morals, and Fitch believed that inciting racial discord qualified. But he also believed that federal interference was worse than local problems. So he delivered the letters without comment and mentioned them to Amos Kettering at church. Kettering thanked him and filed the information in his ledger. On March 10th, a traveling photographer named Edward Mills passed through Council Grove and stopped at the Brantley farm to ask permission to photograph their property. He was compiling a book of homestead images for sale, back east, romantic portraits of frontier life that would feed the nation's appetite for westward mythology. The Brantleys refused politely but firmly. Isaiah said, "We're private people. We don't need attention." Mills thought nothing of it at the time, but when he returned to Council Grove and mentioned the encounter at Rebecca Holloway's boarding house, the conversation at the dinner table went quiet. A man in traveling clothes, Mills later learned he was one of the council members, said, "Private people with secrets, I'd wager." Mills left town the next morning. He would not learn about the attack until 2 years later, when he returned to Kansas and found the Brantley property abandoned. He never included it in his book. 21 men knew the attack was coming. Their wives knew. Their children knew. The storekeepers who sold them rope and kerosene knew. The stable hands who prepared their horses knew. At least 60 people in Council Grove and the surrounding farms had enough information to warn the Brantleys, or to alert what remained of federal authority, or to simply refuse participation. No one did. This was not exceptional. It was ordinary. The mundane math of complicity. Speaking up meant becoming a target yourself, and staying silent cost nothing except a night's sleep. Most people chose sleep. Ruth was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Caleb returned from town on March 11th. He drove the wagon around back instead of leaving it by the barn, their signal that he carried information too sensitive to discuss in the open. Ruth followed him into the house, where Isaiah sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle. Esther was kneading bread. Samuel sharpened knives on a whetstone in the corner. The family worked while they talked, maintaining the fiction of normal life. "Kettering's organizing something," Caleb said. 20 men, maybe more. I heard 2 merchants talking outside the bank." Isaiah did not look up from his rifle. "When?" "Soon. They were talking about getting horses ready, about buying rope." "Did they say when?" "No, but they're not hiding it anymore. They want people to know." Ruth pressed her hands into the dough, working it with mechanical precision. "Any names?" Caleb listed 7 men he had identified. Isaiah committed them to memory. He did not write things down. Paper could be discovered, used as evidence. Everything stayed in his head. Names, faces, habits, patterns. He knew which of those 7 men rode well and which were farm riders who would struggle in rough country. He knew who would break first under pressure. Esther spoke without stopping her work. "They'll come at dawn. That's when people are slowest." "Probably." "Do we leave?" Samuel asked. It was the question they always circled back to. They could abandon the farm tonight, take what fit in the wagon, and disappear into the black settlements farther west. Nicodemus would take them. So would the all-black towns in Indian territory. They could start over, build another farm, live without the constant readiness that defined their lives here. But leaving meant surrendering. It meant accepting that white men could always drive them away, that nowhere was safe for long. Isaiah finished reassembling his rifle. "We've left before. Every time we lose something. This time we stay." "They'll outnumber us," Ruth said. 4 against 20. "Numbers don't matter if they're in the wrong place. We built this farm for this fight." The family had discussed this possibility for 3 years. They had planned for it, prepared positions, rehearsed the movements. Each of them knew their role without needing orders. But knowing and doing were different things, and the prospect of actually fighting 20 armed men made the air in the kitchen feel thin. Esther asked, "Do we try to warn them off? Give them a chance to turn back?" "No," Isaiah said. "If they come armed, they've already made their choice. We don't owe them mercy they wouldn't show us." This was the coldest part of Isaiah's logic. He believed in reciprocity. You got back what you gave. White raiders who burned black farms could expect their own homes to burn. Men who lynched freedmen should not be surprised when freedmen shot back. It was not justice. Isaiah did not believe in justice anymore, but it was balance. And balance required that consequences be immediate and severe enough to make others reconsider. They had no illusions about surviving, only about taking enough men with them to make the price too high. Over the next 12 days, the family moved through the rituals that had kept them alive for 3 years. Ruth cooked enough food to feed travelers and stored the rest in the cellar. Caleb checked every weapon, every powder charge, every cap. Esther walked the property at night, memorizing the locations of bells, wires, and dug pits. Samuel repaired the tunnel entrance, reinforcing the beams and clearing drainage. Isaiah returned to the ledger he kept in his head, reviewing every detail of the men he expected to face. Amos Kettering, methodical but inexperienced with violence. Elijah Moss, soft, would hesitate. The others were unknown quantities, but Isaiah assumed they would follow Kettering's lead until the first shots were fired. After that, panic would determine who acted and who fled. The family said grace before meals and sang hymns in the evening. They maintained every appearance of normal life. Travelers still stopped at the farm. Ruth still fed them. Isaiah still offered advice on which trails were safe. But underneath the routine, they were preparing for a fight that would end with either the Council of Preservation destroyed or the Brantley farm erased from existence. On March 22nd, the day before the attack, Isaiah gathered his family on the porch at sunset. The sky was red and gold, streaked with clouds that looked like ribs. He did not make a speech. He simply said, "Whatever happens, tomorrow, we stay together. If one falls, the others keep fighting. If we lose, we make sure they remember what it cost." Ruth nodded. The children nodded. They went inside and prepared the house the way soldiers prepare a fortress. by making every corner a potential stronghold and every window a potential grave for someone outside. The Council of Preservation gathered at Kettering's store at 2 a.m. on March 23rd. 21 men, as planned. Each brought a rifle, a sidearm, and enough ammunition for a sustained fight. They wore ordinary clothes, no hoods, no regalia, because they were not a mob. They were citizens performing an unpleasant duty. Kettering had made coffee and set out cold biscuits. The men ate in silence, checking weapons and gear. A few talked quietly about the plan. Approach from the west, where the trail was widest. Surround the house. Call Isaiah Brantley out to answer questions. If he refused, if he fired on them, burn everything. Elijah Moss, the banker, looked pale. We're still giving them a chance to surrender? Of course, Kettering said. We're not murderers. We're restoring law. But everyone in that room understood that the distinction depended entirely on whether the Brantleys came out peacefully, and no one believed they would. They rode out at 3:30, following the Santa Fe Trail north toward the Brantley property. The night was moonless, overcast, so dark that horses stumbled on the uneven ground. Kettering led, with Moss beside him. The others followed in a loose column, nervous but committed. Several carried torches that they kept unlit until needed. They reached the boundary of the Brantley property at 4:45, just as the sky was beginning to gray in the east. Kettering halted the column and gathered the men in a loose circle. He went over the plan one final time. They would surround the house, position men at all 4 sides, and wait for full daylight before calling Isaiah out. If shooting started, they would concentrate fire on the windows and doors until the family surrendered or the house burned. No one mentioned the possibility that the family might already be gone, that Isaiah might have anticipated this and evacuated days ago. It was easier to believe the Brantleys would be there, waiting, than to consider that all this preparation might end with an empty house. They moved forward in pairs, spreading out to encircle the property. The first man died at 5:03, just as the sun touched the horizon. His name was Thomas Warner, and he was a farmer who had joined the council because his cousin had disappeared near the Brantley place in 1878. Warner was riding along the north fence line when his horse stepped into a covered pit. The pit was 4 feet deep, lined with sharpened stakes. The horse broke both front legs and fell forward. Warner went over its head and landed on the stakes. He screamed once, then went silent. The men nearest him froze. One shouted, "Trap! They've set traps!" Panic spread faster than orders. Men who had been advancing cautiously now stopped completely, afraid to move. Kettering tried to restore order, calling out that they should hold position, but his voice was drowned by another scream from the east side of the property. A second man had ridden into barbed wire strung between trees at neck height. The wire caught him across the throat and pulled him backward off his horse. He hit the ground, choking. The farm was not a fortress. It was a trap with a house inside. Kettering realized too late that they had been funneled into positions Isaiah wanted them in. The gaps in the fence were not gaps. They were gates designed to channel riders into kill zones. The trails that looked safe were exactly where the Brantleys had placed wires, pits, and sight lines. "Fall back!" Kettering shouted. "Regroup at the trail!" But falling back meant crossing ground they had just ridden over, and that ground was no longer safe. A third man's horse stepped on a covered board studded with nails. The horse reared, throwing its rider into the grass. The man scrambled to his feet and ran. He made it 20 yards before rifle fire from the house caught him in the leg. He went down screaming. The family was shooting now, not wildly, but with deliberate precision. Isaiah fired from the front room, Caleb from the loft window, Esther from the kitchen, Samuel from the barn. Each shot was aimed, spaced, designed to make the raiders believe there were more defenders than four. Men were shouting, horses were panicking, and the sky was growing lighter by the minute, which meant the Brantleys could see their targets more clearly, while the raiders were silhouetted against the rising sun. Kettering tried to rally the men. "Form a line, return fire, concentrate on the house!" But forming a line meant standing in the open within rifle range of the farm. 3 men tried it. 2 were hit immediately. The third ran toward the trees along the creek, triggering a bell that rang loudly enough to make him change direction. He ran straight into another wire trap and fell hard. By 5:20, the Council of Preservation had fired perhaps 50 rounds and hit nothing. The Brantleys had fired fewer than 20 rounds and hit 6 men, 3 fatally. Moss, the banker, rode up beside Kettering. His face was white. "We need to retreat. This was a mistake." "We can still burn them out," Kettering said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How? We can't get close enough to throw torches." It was true. The house was surrounded by open ground that offered no cover. Anyone who tried to approach on foot would be shot before reaching the porch. And trying to ride in meant crossing the same ground where 3 men had already died in traps. Kettering made a decision. "We pull back to the trail. We surround the property from a distance and wait them out. They can't stay in that house forever." But as he said it, he knew it was wrong. The Brantleys had water, food, ammunition. The council had none of those things. They were exposed on open ground with wounded men and panicking horses. This was not a siege. This was a rout. The council retreated to the trail at 5:35, leaving 3 dead men and 2 wounded on the Brantley property. Kettering tried to count heads and came up short. 18 men accounted for. 21 had started. 3 dead, but that should leave 18. He counted again. 17. "Who's missing?" he asked. No one knew. In the chaos, men had scattered in different directions, and now in the growing daylight, someone was unaccounted for. Kettering sent 2 men to search the tree line. They returned 10 minutes later, shaking their heads. No sign. The missing man was named Jacob Fuller, and he had ridden toward the creek when the shooting started. No one saw where he went after that. He would never be found. The wounded men were loaded into a wagon. One was unconscious, the other begging for water. Moss wanted to take them back to Council Grove immediately. Kettering refused. "We're not leaving. We're finishing this." "How? We can't get near the house." Kettering stared at the Brantley farm. The white clapboard caught the morning light, peaceful and quiet. Smoke rose from the chimney. It looked like any homestead on a Sunday morning, except for the bodies lying in the grass between the fence line and the house. "We wait for dark," Kettering said. "Then we burn them out." The men were skeptical. Several wanted to leave immediately, but Kettering pulled rank, citing the authority of the council, and most stayed. They spent the day in a makeshift camp half a mile from the property, taking turns watching the house through a spyglass. They saw no movement. The Brantleys stayed inside. At 3 in the afternoon, a supply wagon came up the trail from Council Grove. Rebecca Holloway had sent food, cornbread and salt pork, along with bandages and a note that said simply, "Finish this." It was not clear whether she meant finish the fight or finish and come home. Either way, it was the only support they received. The town was watching from a distance. waiting to see who won before choosing sides. By sunset, the council had developed a new plan. They would approach the farm after full dark, moving on foot, carrying torches and kerosene. They would set fire to the barn first, which would force the family to either abandon the house or watch their supplies burn. Either way, the council would have the advantage. At 8:45, with the sky fully dark, 15 men moved toward the Brantley property. 6 had refused to go, fear or injury or simple exhaustion, leaving Kettering with a force less than half what he started with. But 15 was enough to set a fire. They moved slowly, feeling their way through the dark, avoiding the trails they had used that morning. They stayed in the grass, going prone when they thought they heard something, then crawling forward. It took them an hour to cover 300 yards. At 9:50, they reached the barn. No shots had been fired. No bells had rung. The barn was dark, apparently unguarded. Kettering motioned for 2 men to circle around and approach from the far side. He and 3 others would enter from the front. Once inside, they would pour kerosene on the stored hay and set it ablaze. The plan worked perfectly until they were inside the barn. Then the doors slammed shut. Caleb had been waiting in the loft. He dropped a beam across the door brackets, sealing the barn from the outside. The men inside panicked, shouting, pushing against the doors. Kettering realized immediately what was happening. They had walked into a trap, and now they were locked inside a wooden structure filled with dry hay and kerosene they had brought themselves. From outside the barn, Esther lit a torch and threw it onto the roof. The cedar shakes caught immediately, flames spreading in both directions from where the torch landed. Inside, the men screamed. They tried to break through the walls, but the oak planks held. They tried to force the doors, but the beam was solid. Smoke poured into the barn through gaps in the roof. Within 3 minutes, visibility dropped to 0. The men outside the barn heard the screaming and ran. They did not try to free the trapped men. They did not try to douse the flames. They ran toward the trail, through the darkness, triggering bells and wires and stumbling over ground they could not see. 2 more men fell into pits. One broke his ankle on barbed wire. Another simply disappeared, and his body would not be found for 3 weeks. By 10:15, the barn was fully engulfed. The flames reached 60 feet high, bright enough to cast shadows a quarter-mile away. The men trapped inside had stopped screaming. From the house, Isaiah watched through a rifle scope. He counted 7 men fleeing toward the trail, 7 out of 15 who had approached the barn. 8 had died inside or disappeared trying to escape. The council had started with 21 men. Now, fewer than 10 remained. But the night was not over. At 10:40, Isaiah saw lights in the cornfield west of the house. Not torches, lanterns. 5 of them, bobbing through the stalks like will-o'-the-wisps, moving in a pattern that made no sense. Forward, then sideways, then back, then forward again. The men watching from the trail saw them too and grew confused. Were the Brantleys trying to signal someone? Were they evacuating through the corn? The truth was simpler. Ruth and Samuel were carrying lanterns on long poles, moving through the field in random patterns to create the illusion of many people. The council members who remained could not see the trick in the dark. They saw lights moving and assumed it meant the Brantleys were vulnerable, distracted, perhaps trying to escape. 3 men decided to attack the house while the family was supposedly occupied in the corn. They approached from the south, where the ground was flattest. They moved quickly, rifles ready, emboldened by desperation and rage. They reached the porch at 10:58. The front door was open. They entered. Inside, the house was dark and silent. The men called out challenges, swept their rifles through the rooms, found nothing. The kitchen was empty. The bedrooms were empty. The family was gone. Then they heard the sound of nails being driven. Someone was boarding up the windows from outside. The men ran to the windows and saw Caleb and Esther nailing planks across the frames. They fired through the glass, shattering windows, but the planks held. They tried the door and found it barred from outside. They were trapped. Isaiah's voice came from somewhere outside, calm and clear. You came to burn us out. Now you know how it feels. The men inside screamed and begged. They offered money, promised to leave, swore they would tell no one what happened. Isaiah did not respond. He simply waited. At 11:15, Ruth lit a torch and dropped it through the chimney. The house burned slower than the barn, stone foundation, dirt-packed walls, but it burned. The men inside broke through the floor into the cellar and found the tunnel entrance. They crawled through, desperate, only to emerge at the creek and find Samuel waiting with a rifle. One man was shot immediately. The second raised his hands and begged for mercy. Samuel considered this. He thought about all the black families who had begged for mercy from white men over the past 200 years. Then he shot him. The third man was faster. He ran into the darkness along the creek bed, stumbling, falling, pulling himself up and running again. He made it half a mile before exhaustion or injury stopped him. He crawled into a hollow beneath a fallen tree and waited for dawn. He was the only council member who survived the night. Dawn on March 24th broke clear and cold. The Brantley farm was unrecognizable. The house was a blackened shell, smoke still rising from collapsed timbers. The barn was gone completely, just foundation stones and ash. The cornfield was trampled, lanterns smashed where Ruth and Samuel had dropped them when retreating to the tunnel. Bodies lay scattered across the property like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Amos Kettering sat on the trail with 6 other men. They were the remnant of the Council of Preservation. 14 men had died on the property overnight. 5 in the barn, 3 in the house, 6 in the various traps and ambushes around the perimeter. 3 others were unaccounted for, missing in the dark, possibly dead, possibly fled. 7 survivors out of 21. Kettering's ledger was ash in the burned house. His careful records, his documented chain of command, his proof of order, all gone. What remained was bodies and a truth that no ledger could contain. The council had not restored order. They had been slaughtered by 4 people who understood violence better than they did. We need to report this, Moss said. His voice was hoarse from smoke and shouting. We need the marshal, the army, someone. Report what? Kettering asked. That we attacked a homestead and lost? They murdered 14 men. We came to kill them first. They were defending their property. The logic of it was inescapable, even to Kettering. The council had ridden onto private land with weapons and hostile intent. Under Kansas territorial law, the Brantleys had every right to defend themselves. The fact that they had done so with devastating effectiveness did not change the legal framework, but it did change what came next. At 7:30, the survivors rode back to Council Grove. They did not speak to each other. Each man was calculating how to explain what happened, how to describe the night without admitting they had participated in an illegal raid that cost 14 lives. Some would claim they were never there. Others would say they left before the violence started. None would tell the full truth. Complicity works both ways. The men who had enabled the raid now had to cover it up. Rebecca Holloway saw them return. She counted 7 men where 21 had left. She did not ask questions. She simply prepared rooms and hot water and medical supplies for the wounded. She would maintain this silence for the rest of her life, taking the full story to her grave in 1903. At the Brantley farm, Isaiah stood in the smoking ruins of his house. Ruth beside him, the children arrayed behind. They had survived. They had won. But winning meant everything they had built was destroyed. 3 years of work reduced to ash and bodies. "We need to leave," Caleb said, "before the army comes, before they send real soldiers." Isaiah nodded. He had known this would be the outcome. You could defeat white raiders, but you could not defeat the system that produced them. Eventually, that system would send enough men with enough weapons that even the best prepared family would be overwhelmed. "Where do we go?" Esther asked. "West, past Nicodemus. There are black towns in Indian Territory where no one asks questions." "What about the bodies?" Samuel asked. Isaiah looked at the 14 dead men scattered across his property. "Leave them. Let whoever comes find them exactly as they are. Let them see what happened when 20 men came to murder a family, and the family fought back. They worked quickly, gathering what they could carry. Weapons, ammunition, tools, money hidden in the tunnel. The wagon was intact, sheltered in a ravine during the fight. They loaded it in 2 hours and hitched the mule. By 9:30, they were ready to leave. Ruth took one last walk through the ruins. She found the spot where her kitchen table had stood, where she had fed so many travelers. She thought about the families who would never stop here again, who would arrive to find nothing but burned timbers and bloodstains. "We made this place safe," she said to Isaiah. "For 3 years, people could stop here and breathe. And now they'll have to breathe somewhere else," Isaiah replied. "But they'll remember. They'll tell stories. That matters." At 10:07, the Brantley family drove their wagon west along the creek bed, avoiding the main trail. They moved slowly, carefully, leaving no clear tracks. Behind them, the farm smoked in the morning sun. Ahead, the prairie stretched endless and indifferent. They did not look back. William Thatcher was 31 years old, a farmer who had joined the Council of Preservation because his brother had disappeared near the Brantley place in 1878. He was the 3rd man who entered the Brantley house during the final assault. He was also the man who escaped through the tunnel and ran along the creek bed until exhaustion dropped him into a hollow beneath a fallen tree. He spent March 24th hiding. He could hear activity at the farm, voices, wagon sounds, something heavy being dragged. He stayed motionless, afraid that moving would reveal his position. His left arm was broken where he had fallen in the tunnel. His ribs ached. He was bleeding from cuts across his face and hands. At sunset, when the sounds from the farm stopped, he crawled out of the hollow and started toward Council Grove. It took him 9 hours to cover 6 miles. He crawled on his knees and one good arm, following the creek because he was afraid to use the trail. Twice he heard horses and hid in the brush until they passed. Once he thought he saw figures moving through the trees and froze for an hour, certain the Brantleys were hunting survivors. He reached the outskirts of Council Grove at 3:47 in the morning on March 25th. A dog found him first, barking until its owner came outside with a lamp. The owner was Thomas Gareth, the blacksmith who had shod horses for council members before the raid. Gareth helped Thatcher into his shop and gave him water. He did not ask questions. He did not offer to fetch a doctor. He simply sat with Thatcher until the man could speak. "They killed everyone," Thatcher said. His voice was broken, ragged. "They had traps everywhere. They burned the barn with men inside. They boarded up the house and burned it. They shot people trying to escape. They're not human. They're something else. Gareth listened without expression. Finally, he asked, "Are they still there? At the farm?" "I don't know. I heard them leave. Wagon sounds. But I don't know." "You need to tell the marshal." "There is no marshal." "Then whoever's in charge." But no one was in charge. Council Grove had no law enforcement. The county had no sheriff. The nearest federal marshal was in Topeka, 80 miles away. And even if Thatcher sent a telegram, what would he say? That a council of vigilantes had attacked a black homestead and been destroyed. Gareth set Thatcher's broken arm using splints and strips of leather. He bandaged the cuts. He gave him a blanket and let him sleep in the shop's back room. When Thatcher woke at noon, Gareth had made a decision. "You need to leave town," he said. "What?" "If people know you survived, they'll ask questions. You'll have to explain what the council did. Some will call you a coward for running. Others will want revenge on the Brantleys. Either way, you become the center of something that's better left buried." Thatcher stared at him. "You're telling me to pretend I was never there?" "I'm telling you that 14 men died on that property, and the people who killed them are gone. There's no justice to pursue. There's no enemy to fight. There's just bodies and ruin. Let it end." 14 men died because they believed black families were easy targets. One man survived because a blacksmith understood that some stories should not be told. Thatcher left Council Grove that evening, riding a horse Gareth loaned him. He rode south toward Indian Territory, where he would eventually settle under a different name. He would tell no one what happened on the Brantley farm, and he would carry the memory like a stone in his chest until he died in 1909. His silence was not unusual. In the months following March 23rd, nearly everyone connected to the council chose silence. The families of the dead men were told their relatives had been killed in a raid, but details were vague. Some families accepted this. Others suspected more but knew better than to ask questions that might implicate their own. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the edges of the Council Grove Cemetery, far from the plots reserved for respectable citizens. No minister presided. No headstones were carved. The dead simply disappeared into the earth, and their names disappeared from conversation. Only Amos Kettering tried to maintain a record. He kept his own ledger at home, where he documented the council's formation, its purpose, and its destruction. He wrote it in plain language, not code, because he believed someone should know what happened. But he also locked the ledger in a trunk, and when he died in 1896, his widow burned it without reading it. The official story, repeated in Council Grove for the next 50 years, was that a group of men had disappeared while hunting bandits. The Brantley farm burned in a fire of unknown origin. No one was held responsible. The land reverted to the county for unpaid taxes and was eventually sold to a cattle company. History recorded none of it. On April 2nd, 1879, a federal land inspector named Clayton Morris arrived in Council Grove to investigate a report of abandoned homestead claims. His job was to determine whether properties were being worked according to the Homestead Act or should be returned to federal control for resale. The Brantley claim was on his list. Morris was a bureaucrat, not an investigator. He carried forms, not weapons. He expected to find an empty farm, make a note, and move to the next property. What he found instead changed his understanding of the frontier entirely. The Brantley property was a graveyard. Morris counted 11 bodies in various stages of decay. Some had been partially buried by wind-blown soil. Others lay where they had fallen, picked at by scavengers. The house and barn were burned ruins. The fields showed signs of violent activity. Trampled corn, broken fences, blood-stained grass. It looked like a battlefield. Morris spent 4 hours documenting the scene. He sketched the positions of bodies, noted visible wounds, measured distances. His report, filed with the Department of the Interior on April 9th, ran to 12 pages. Excerpt from the Morris Report, April 9th, 1879. Property shows evidence of sustained armed conflict. 11 bodies discovered, all male, all white. Cause of death varies: gunshot wounds, burns, blunt trauma. House and barn destroyed by fire. Defensive preparations visible around property, including covered pits, wire traps, and prepared firing positions. Conclusion: homesteaders engaged in organized defense against armed attack. Attackers suffered total defeat. Homesteaders' current whereabouts unknown. The report was forwarded to the U.S. Marshal's office in Topeka. It was read, filed, and forgotten. No investigation followed. No arrest warrants were issued. The Marshal's office concluded that whatever had happened at the Brantley farm was a local matter, already resolved by the outcome. The homesteaders had defended their property and left. The attackers were dead. Justice, in a frontier sense, had been served. Morris returned to Council Grove to ask questions. He learned nothing. No one claimed to know who the dead men were. No one admitted recognizing them. When Morris showed sketches of the bodies to merchants and townspeople, they all shook their heads. Strangers, they said. Drifters. Possibly cattle thieves or bandits. Certainly not local men. Morris knew he was being lied to, but he also knew he had no authority to compel testimony. His job was land inspection, not criminal investigation. He made a note in his personal journal. Council Grove protects its own, even in death. He left town on April 7th and never returned. The Morris Report remained buried in federal archives until 1974, when a graduate student researching homestead law discovered it while cataloging Interior Department documents. The student, whose name was Jennifer Calloway, recognized immediately that she had found something significant. Documented evidence of black homesteaders successfully defending themselves against a large-scale attack. She tried to research further, but found nothing. No local newspaper coverage, no county records, no family histories. The Brantley name appeared on the homestead claim filed in 1876, then vanished completely. It was as if the family had been erased from existence. Calloway published a brief article about the Morris Report in the Journal of Western History in 1976. The article noted that the Brantley case represented an anomaly in homestead violence. Black settlers who not only survived an attack, but killed all their attackers and escaped. The article concluded with a question. What happened to the Brantley family after April 1879? No one answered for decades. The Brantley family reached the Cimarron River on April 8, 1879. They had traveled nearly 200 miles in 16 days, moving slowly to avoid attention, camping away from settlements, buying supplies only when necessary. The wagon held everything they owned: tools, seeds, weapons, and $437 in cash. The accumulated savings from 3 years of farming, plus money taken from travelers who had paid for safe passage. They stopped at a black settlement called Liberty, 20 miles north of what would eventually become Oklahoma City. Liberty was home to 37 families, all formerly enslaved, all trying to build lives in Indian territory, where federal authority was weak and tribal law was negotiable. The settlement had a church, a school, and a shared understanding that no one asked too many questions about the past. Isaiah met with the settlement's council on April 10th. He explained that his family needed land to farm and a place where white raiders would not find them. He did not explain what happened in Kansas. The council asked no questions. They had all run from something. The Brantleys were given 40 acres on the settlement's eastern edge, near the timberline. They rebuilt a smaller house, a simpler barn, fields that produced enough to eat but not enough to attract attention. They did not paint the clapboard white. They did not string bells in trees. They did not dig tunnels or pits. They farmed like ordinary people, and it nearly destroyed them. Ruth could not sleep without checking windows. Caleb kept a loaded rifle by his bed and woke at every sound. Esther startled at shadows. Samuel developed a habit of walking the property perimeter every night, checking for tracks, for signs that riders had come. They had traded one kind of violence for another, external threat for internal damage. The constant readiness that had kept them alive in Kansas now consumed them in Oklahoma. They could not relax. They could not trust. They could not believe they were safe because they had learned too thoroughly that nowhere was safe. The cost of survival was learning you could never stop surviving. Isaiah recognized the pattern in 1881. He saw it in Ruth's hollow eyes, in the way Caleb flinched when someone approached from behind, in Esther's refusal to speak to strangers. They were killing themselves slowly, consuming the fear they had used to kill others. He called a family meeting in March of 1881, 2 years after leaving Kansas. "We can't keep living like this," he said. "We can't keep waiting for the next fight." "Then what do we do?" Ruth asked. "We stop being hunters. We stop being prey. We decide we're something else." It was easier said than achieved. The family had spent 15 years, from slavery through war through Kansas, learning to see the world as a place where violence was inevitable and preparation was survival. Unlearning that required conscious, daily effort. It required deciding that the man walking toward your property was not a threat until he proved otherwise. It required sleeping without weapons. It required trusting that tomorrow would not bring riders in the dark. Slowly, over the next 5 years, they managed it. Caleb married a woman from Liberty named Hannah. They had 3 children. Esther became a teacher at the settlement school. Samuel started a freight business, hauling supplies between Indian Territory and Kansas. Ruth planted a garden again, this time just for beauty. Isaiah trained horses and advised younger homesteaders on where to build and how to prepare for storms. They became ordinary. By 1886, the Brantleys were respected members of Liberty Settlement. Their Kansas past was known vaguely. People understood they had trouble with raiders, but details were not discussed. It was enough to know that the family had survived and chosen to build rather than destroy. But Isaiah kept one piece of the past. In a locked box beneath his bed, he stored a journal where he had recorded every name. The 63 people he tracked as a slave, the 37 Confederates he found during the war, the 14 council members who died on his Kansas property. 114 names total. He did not know all their stories. He did not know if they deserved their fates, but he knew they were part of him, woven into the man he had become. He opened the box once a year on April 8th, the anniversary of reaching the Cimarron River. He read the names silently, acknowledging them, then closed the box again. Ruth found the journal after Isaiah died in 1893. She read it once, understood what it represented, and burned it. There were some memories the world did not need. In 1976, Jennifer Calloway published her article about the Morris Report. In 1978, she received a letter from a woman named Dorothy Fletcher, who claimed to be the great-granddaughter of Samuel Brantley. The letter included a photograph: 4 people standing in front of a clapboard house in Oklahoma, circa 1900. On the back, written in faded ink, Isaiah, Ruth, Esther, Samuel, Liberty Settlement. Calloway tried to verify the connection. She traveled to Oklahoma, searched county records, interviewed elderly residents of communities descended from Liberty Settlement. She found fragments: a homestead claim filed by Samuel Brantley in 1895, a marriage certificate for Esther Brantley, and a man named James Cooper in 1888, a death record for Isaiah Brantley in 1893, listing his birthplace as Mississippi. But she found no documentation of what happened in Kansas. The Morris County Courthouse had no records of the Council of Preservation. The Council Grove newspaper for March 1879 made no mention of missing men or a burned homestead. The land office showed the Brantley claim as abandoned in 1879, sold at auction in 1882. That was all. It was as if 24 people, the Brantleys and the council members, had agreed to erase an entire chapter of history. Calloway published a follow-up article in 1981 titled "The Disappeared: Black Homesteaders and Historical Erasure." The article argued that stories like the Brantleys were systematically excluded from frontier history because they contradicted the dominant narrative of white settlement and black passivity. She wrote, "We have records of countless attacks on black homesteaders. We have documentation of lynchings, arsons, massacres, but we have almost no records of successful resistance, of black families who fought back and won. Why? Because the people who kept records were the same people who benefited from the attacks. And when those attacks failed, when white raiders died and black families survived, the response was not to document the outcome, but to erase it entirely." The article generated controversy. Some historians praised it as necessary corrective. Others dismissed it as speculation based on insufficient evidence. A few pointed out that the absence of records proved nothing. Frontier violence was often undocumented, regardless of who won or lost. Calloway died in 2003 without ever finding definitive proof of what happened on the Brantley farm. But she had collected enough fragments: the Morris Report, the photograph, the oral histories from Liberty descendants, to establish that the family existed, survived, and disappeared from official records at precisely the moment they should have been most visible. The story remained in academic limbo, too well documented to dismiss, too poorly documented to confirm. In 2012, a filmmaker named Marcus Webb traveled to Morris County to document abandoned homesteads. He was making a short film about the Exoduster movement, focusing on the gap between the promise of Western land and the reality of isolation and violence. A local historian mentioned the Brantley place. "It's just a field now," the historian said, "but older folks still won't go there after dark." Webb visited the site on October 15, 2012. The land had been farmed continuously since the 1880s, the buildings long gone. Nothing remained except a slight depression where the house foundation had been. But standing there, Webb felt the wrongness the historian had mentioned. It was not dramatic. No cold spots, no ghostly visions, just a sense that something had happened here that left a mark deeper than physical ruins. He interviewed 3 elderly residents of Council Grove. Two refused to discuss the Brantley farm. The third, a woman named Margaret Holloway, 96 years old, said her great-grandmother Rebecca had owned a boarding house in town during the 1870s. Rebecca had kept a diary that Margaret's mother inherited and eventually destroyed. "But Mom told me one story before she died," Margaret said, "about a group of men who rode out one night to burn a black family off their land. Most of the men never came back. The ones who did wouldn't talk about it. Mom said her grandmother wrote in her diary that the town decided to forget it ever happened because remembering meant taking sides, and taking sides meant trouble." Webb asked if there were descendants of the Brantley family still living. Margaret shook her head. "If there are, they're not using that name. Who would? After what happened? After the town tried to erase them? Why would you keep a name that marked you?" She was right. Webb searched genealogical databases and found dozens of Brantleys in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas during the late 1800s. But none clearly descended from Isaiah and Ruth. The family had either died out, changed names, or simply blended into the larger black population of the Western Territories. Webb included a brief segment about the Brantley farm in his documentary, which premiered at a film festival in 2013. The segment lasted 4 minutes. It showed the empty field, played audio from Margaret Holloway's interview, and ended with a title card. "The Brantley family's fate remains unknown." After the screening, an elderly black man approached Webb. His name was Robert Fletcher, Dorothy Fletcher's son, the man whose mother had written to Jennifer Calloway in 1978. He was 81 years old. "My mother always said we came from fighters," Robert told Webb. "She said our people survived because they knew when to run and when to stand. She said there was a farm in Kansas where white men learned that black families weren't easy prey. That's all she said. She never told us names or details, just that we should remember. Our people fought back." Webb asked if Robert knew anything more specific. "No, but I remember one thing. My mother kept a photograph from 1890-something, 4 people in Oklahoma. On the back someone had written, 'We moved our web farther west.' I always wondered what that meant. It meant they survived. It meant they built their fortress somewhere else. It meant the story didn't end in Kansas. The land where the Brantley farm stood produces corn and soybeans now. The current owner, a farming corporation based in Wichita, has no knowledge of what happened there in 1879. The field is worked by GPS-guided tractors that follow grid patterns optimized for yield. Nothing marks the site except coordinates in a database. But among the black families who trace their roots to the Exoduster movement, the story persists. It changes with each telling. Details shift, numbers vary, names get confused, but the core remains. There was a family who built a safe place in dangerous territory, who fought off raiders who came to destroy them, who vanished before they could be captured. Some versions say the family killed 100 men. Others say they were never attacked, that the whole story is myth. A few claim the Brantleys are still out there somewhere, running safe houses for people fleeing violence, still stringing bells and digging tunnels, still teaching that survival requires both intelligence and the willingness to fight. The truth is simpler and stranger. The Brantleys were real. They did run a safe farm. They did kill raiders who came for them. And they did disappear, not into death, but into the West, where they rebuilt under different circumstances and tried to unlearn the skills that had kept them alive. Their descendants are scattered across America now, carrying genes and stories that trace back to a Mississippi plantation where a man learned to track people, to a Kansas homestead where a family turned those skills into defense, to an Oklahoma settlement where they finally learned to rest. Most of those descendants don't know the full story. They know fragments. Great-great-grandfather was good at finding things. Great-great-grandmother fed travelers. Family came from Kansas before Oklahoma. The pieces don't quite fit together unless you know what you're looking for. But every few years, someone finds another fragment. A letter in an archive, a photograph in an estate sale, a mention in a forgotten government report. And slowly, the story assembles itself. 4 people who refused to be victims, who built a fortress disguised as a farm, who taught their enemies that black families were neither helpless nor forgiving. The Brantleys understood something the council never learned, that violence is a language, and fluency requires practice, patience, and a willingness to speak it better than your opponent. They spoke it fluently, and then, when the conversation ended, they walked away and spoke something else. That might be the most dangerous part of their story. Not that they could kill, but that they could stop. Somewhere in America, someone is descended from Isaiah and Ruth Brantley. They don't know it, but the story knows them. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.